I welcome you all to the 37th seminar of the International Interdisciplinary PhD in Progress Seminar Series, Phase 3, organized by the Global South Network. I would like to start the session by thanking the organizer of this week's seminar series, Dr. Nouman Riyad, lecturer in law at the Leicester Law School and the founder and convener of the Global South Network. My name is Haitham. I'm a professor and director of the Master of Arts in Museum Studies program at Southern University at New Orleans, of course, in the US. I'm a proud alumnus of the School of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester with 2 published books, my articles, and book chapters. My research focuses on innovation, diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice in the museum context. Throughout my career, I've been fortunate to contribute as a reviewer for various organizations, such as the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities. I have also had the honor of serving on museum boards and cultural heritage organizations, and I'm now serving as a commissioner on the America 250 Louisiana State Commission. Dr. Stella Basinyi is a discussant for today's session. She is a lecturer in heritage and digital creativity at the University of York and has a multidisciplinary background in archaeology, cultural studies, and heritage management. She studied PhD in heritage management at Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. Before joining the University of York, she was a postdoctorate research fellow and Advancing Woman Fellow at the University of Cape Town Department of Archaeology and Human Evolution Research Institution. Dr. Cessare Cuzzola is another discussant for today's session. He is a research associate at the School of Museum Studies, University of Leicester. His academic background is in anthropology with a specific focus on material culture studies. His research focuses on the role of collections in socially engaged practice, exploring how material culture is used and interpreted in museum projects that tackle contemporary social issues.
Geonyoung Kim is a peer commentator for today's session. She's a PhD candidate at the Department of Archaeology, University of Cambridge. Her PhD thesis explores the role of museums in the process of reconciliation. She's using exhibitions on the Korean War in South Korea as case studies to study the impact of museums on how the present society negotiates its relationship with the conflicting past. She uses visual analysis method, textual analysis, image analysis, object analysis to explore the narrative construction and visual communications in museums.
Last but not the least, our guest speaker for today's session is Isabel Collazos, PhD candidate at the School of Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester. Isabel will present her project titled When Decolonizations Entered the Museum in Bolivia, Confronting Critical Research with Indigenous Revival and Technologies of Representation. Isabel, you have 30 to 35 minutes for the presentation, which will be followed by 7 minutes for comments and questions from the discussant and peer commentator, and 15 minutes for questions and answer session by attendees. So the floor is
everybody for being here today, to the chair, discussants, and the peer commentator. And I would also like to thank Dr. Nouman Riyad for inviting me to present my research and for all of his work as convener of the Global South Network. So yes, my presentation is called When Decolonization Enters the Museum in Bolivia, Confronting Critical Research with Indigenous Revival and Technologies of Representation. Currently starting my 3rd year in museum studies and have recently concluded the first part of my fieldwork. So I'll be presenting today some initial questions and ideas that have emerged from it, but please bear in mind that it is very raw material. The presentation will be as follows. I will start with a look at the Bolivian context, as I think it's important to have an idea of how coloniality and decolonization processes have shaped Bolivian history and society. I will then go on to describe some of the details of the project, so the research questions, methodology, and the case studies I've chosen. And then I will present some of these first insights in one particular case study, the Museum of Ethnography and Folklore, and I will finish with some concluding remarks. So, I will focus on Bolivia's history from its independence because the end of the Spanish rule did not lead to the sovereignty of indigenous people. On the contrary, their oppression continued and was reconfigured within the modern paradigm of the 19th century national state. There was a dispossession of indigenous communal land which had been agreed upon within the colonial period, and their exclusion from the state, so they didn't have any voting rights or access to education. In this nation-building period, intellectuals and political elites asked what would the role of indigenous people be in the nation. Were they enemies who would always resist and revolt against the state, or were they good savages who needed to be civilized by the white elites? These questions are cut short by the National Revolution in 1952, which, influenced by socialist ideas, promoted the inclusion of indigenous people to the state through education and an agrarian reform. However, socialist and national paradigms of the time meant that to become Bolivian, people had to put behind their indigeneity, becoming indomestizo, like a mestizo, like a mixed peasants or workers. So again, there's the socialist ideas. The social oppression that also followed of 3 decades of military coups and regimes was met with socioeconomic and eventually cultural resistance, which grew with the globalized indigenous rights movements of the 80s and 90s. So this growing adoption and embracing of indigenous heritage led to more people defining themselves as indigenous. And it was finally in 2005 that the indigenous syndicate leader Evo Morales became president of Bolivia, backed by the MAS Party, the political arm of a coalition of social and popular movements. With a new constitution in 2009, Bolivia became a plurinational state. Decolonization was institutionalized and indigenous citizenship constructed. Today, power has been reconfigured by the inclusion of new actors, and indigeneity is articulated within government spheres and political claims. Decolonization has become mainstream, but nevertheless difficult to define. In public spheres, it can be assimilated to redistribution, representation, or even retaliation. In this context, I have directed my attention towards Bolivian museums. So, museums present diverse research interests from many disciplines and perspectives. In light of the theories and practices around decolonization, these are some of the relevant themes from museums for my research. So there's the role of the past in the present, the representation of ideas, cultures, and priorities through visual and discursive narratives, power and the museum, so the authority of museums and how identity politics come into play. What are the museum aims? Are they constructing a national collective identity and an indigenous alterity? And also the construction of knowledge through museum tools and technologies of collection and representation. These are the research questions I have developed, and to summarize, I have been looking at museum actors, these social actors, individuals or institutions, such as NGOs, international cooperation, who play an important role in heritage projects in Bolivia. There's the language of decolonization. How is it defined, interpreted, and then practiced? The independent museums, and why are these actors deciding to museumize culture and heritage? And finally, I'm thinking about museological expertise and how it is shaped by decolonizing and critical perspectives. I have chosen for my methodology to do multi-sited ethnography. The tools include institutional ethnography, participant observation, discourse and exhibition analysis, and semi-structured interviews. So working with these tools has entailed a few challenges, which may be inherent to the process and even meaningful in insights, but are felt nonetheless as setbacks and problems at the time. So there's a question of different times and agendas, especially when you're doing institutional ethnography. You have to be negotiating access, there are gatekeepers, and that can take more or less time. There's a question of positionality. So what are people projecting on me as a researcher, as a representative of a British university, but also as a Bolivian who does not have a relation to indigenous cultures, also coming from a privileged position. And also, of course, what am I projecting as well on the practitioners, on the actors? There's a lot to unpack there, but I don't want to take more time. There's also the questions that I'm asking about knowledge construction and representations, which are almost absent in the scholarship being produced in Bolivia. And finally, the socio-political context that permeates research and researchers. So it's a moment of a political crisis, economic crisis, environmental crisis, and that is not outside of the research scope. It is outside of the research scope, but it is still within everything that is happening in the fieldwork, in the museum, and for actors. And so these I will present very shortly, the case studies I have selected. The first three are from the Andes region, the west of Bolivia, and the fourth is in the lowlands, the Arte Campo Museum, so a very different geographical and even political context. The first two are national museums, and they have a historical importance, one more with indigenous cultures and the other more colonial. The last two are much younger museums, and what they present is independent museum making strategies. And finally, what I really want to talk about is what I've been obsessing about in the last months. So the Museum of Ethnography and Folklore. These are some of the activities, some of the things I've been participating in, observing, and they have led me to discuss the following three themes, which are the multiple meanings of decolonization, how exhibition narratives contrast to discourse, and what is happening, like the confrontation between strategic essentialism and critical research. So, to begin, the multiple meanings of decolonization. These points are extracted from the interviews I conducted with museum practitioners. So we see first that there is a difference between talking about decolonization and descolonization, at least in Bolivia, because when we talk about descolonization, people think more about the state-led decolonization policies, whereas decolonization or decolonial is more about the more theoretical, more abstract practices. So when asking these questions, a lot of people assimilated Decolonisation to a government practice, and it wasn't seen as independent, and therefore that what they described had to do with what the government, what the state was doing. But there were also other answers a bit more general. So most people talked about centering indigenous voices and knowledge in museum narratives, or having a diversity of voices within the museum. There was also this idea that to care for indigenous artifacts and cultures was inherently decolonizing, just because they have been put aside for so long in Bolivian history. There was a question of representation also by hiring indigenous people. This was something that I could see in the museum staff. There were a lot of indigenous practitioners or people that had a relation to indigenous cultures. But when this wasn't addressed in the interviews as such, and it was more presented like in an abstract principle, and if they gave examples, they were thinking about ministries or other institutions, not their museum, which I thought was interesting. Some people refuse the term decolonization, as they say it recenters colonial lives and perspectives. And a lot of people also talked about an individual process of deconstructing, re-indigenizing, and reconnecting with their ancestral memory and knowledge. It could also have been related to other types of inclusion and gender equality. So we see that practitioners from the same institution had very different ways of understanding and presenting decolonization, but they also, most of them affirmed that the museum was undertaking decolonizing practices. Now, the second theme that I will jump to has to do with the exhibition narratives. So the museum practices co-authorship ethics. So instead of having a researcher, in this case one of the practitioners, interview an informant, this informant is presented as an author, as a co-author in catalog articles, and both of their names will appear as such. So this is a practice that is present in critical and decolonizing research practices, as many of you probably know. But what I found interesting was that when you visit the exhibitions in the museum, this does not appear to be handled in the same way. So here are two images. The picture on the left, this video, is an exhibition from 2014. The one to the right is from 2024. And this co-authorship practice has started in 2021. But like you can see, there are no labels. We don't know the names of the people. We don't know what community they come from. And it's the same for the images that are seen, that are placed there more as decoration, as a setting, because in front there are the artifacts. And what is interesting also is that the image from the right, the curator and exhibition designer had conducted fieldwork with that community. So he did have the information of who were these people. He had talked to them. Another example has to do with this discourse around indigenous communities' lives, knowledges, trying to humanize them so that they stop thinking about them as objects of study. But at the same time, we see in these pictures that these are like sets, like these dioramas that we would see in museums from the, I don't know, 19th, 20th century. And they're presenting groups of people sculpted and represented in a lifelike form with realistic techniques. Even the size, especially in the 2000 24 sculptures are supposed to be lifelike. So despite all of this discourse, they are the people, the indigenous people, are fixed, and they are becoming this museum artifact throughout this within these examples. And like you can see both in these two different exhibitions, this is a strategy, a visual strategy material that they're using in the past 2 years. Another thing I'd like to talk about is how water was represented. So the theme of an annual conference that I attended was water. And in all of the institutional speeches, it was often repeated that water is not just a resource, and implying that it is a being in the social, indigenous world, and criticizing extractivist uses of water. However, in these images of the exhibition that accompanies the conference, we see on the right 2 people fishing, which can be interpreted as water as a resource. And to the left, there are 2 queros, 2 cups, which are artifacts that serve more as agents within the social world. So it is harder to see water represented as a being in the visual and material narratives of this exhibition. And the last point I'd like to talk about is temporality. So the museum proposes to show a continuity of practices and beliefs in the long term. So this is seen in the textile exhibition, where we can see in this image, in the same case, there are different shearing utensils, showing that the technology is not what matters, but its use and practices. However, and we see here in 2 other examples, this effort may cause confusion. These are different exhibitions. So to the right, there's another video. This is from the metals exhibition, and it's the same. It doesn't have a label. We don't know when that video was taken and what practice it is representing in the short term or in the long term, or is it still practice? So to me, it causes a bit of confusion and decontextualizes social actors and their practices, maybe even fixating them in a timeless space that isn't affected by the political, by the social world. In addition, to the left, there is a label. This is from the water exhibition, where we see that it says archaeological period. So this is a new practice from the museum, because they don't want to talk about a pre-Hispanic period, because it would center the Hispanic colonial period. However, by choosing to focus on a disciplinary practice to delimitate time periods, I think this also causes confusion and can even enhance the remoteness of indigenous cultures. Well, to go to the last theme that I will present today about strategic essentialism. So we have seen that a main priority of the museum is recentering and valuing indigenous knowledge. So by doing so, it produces an imaginary in its exhibitions and research of a normative indigeneity, which excludes more composite, multi-layered, contradicting, and dynamic ways of understanding indigeneity and of being indigenous. So here we see these stereotypes of the indigenous world. So it's confined to the past. There are these agricultural practices and the fishing tools used, and also the rural world. There is also a construction of alterity, in particularly in the mural on the right, which represents the lowlands indigenous people. So this museum is in the Andes. The people that work there, they come from that region, from the west, the Andes, and their expertise is mainly from that region as well. And if we also think about Bolivia as a state, politics and power, the power is also in the Andes, and the majority of indigenous people represented in politics come from that region as well. So we see that within indigeneity, there are heterogeneous relations and interactions and a reconstruction of difference. In contrast, there is also interesting things that come from critical research perspectives. So here, this artifact shows a man. It's a reproduction of a man with a duck on its shoulder, and it was excavated in, I think, 2014 from the island of Pariti in Lake Titicaca. A museum worker who is from Pariti said it was called Lord of the Ducks by the archaeologists, but to him this did not make sense and it did not relate to their cosmovision, to their cultural practices and beliefs. So for him, this artifact shows the relationality between the islanders and the local ducks. However, to the right, we see in the label that it says Señor de los Patos, Lord of the Ducks, and it is even translated to Aymara. So why does the museum use that name in the label instead of challenging the archaeologist or maybe including these practitioners' perspectives? To what extent is the museum capable of producing critical research and exhibiting it in its exhibitions, in its catalogs? Is it able to question its own authority in the construction and validation of conventional research institutions and actors that are working alongside itself? So to conclude, in this presentation, I've tried to show the complex ways Bolivian museums, practitioners, and social actors articulate decolonizing ideals and practice. There is a risk of simplifying identities, recentering coloniality, and reconfiguring a univocal authority. As I navigate these preliminary findings, I note that decolonizing and re-indigenizing is not just a superficial claim nor a cultural policy. It raises existential and intimate questions in all Bolivians. In this painting, Cristian Laime Yujra depicts an indigenous Andean, possibly Quechua, conquistador. A colonizer or colonized. What does that mean as indigenous Bolivians access and exert power? The binary that opposes colonized to colonizer fades. As a category, it is still useful to understand how coloniality shapes Bolivian identity, regardless of which heritage or privileges one has. However, with it, other categories and perspectives are important, such as capitalism, social affiliations, socioeconomic strategies, and religious and spiritual beliefs. And so after passing so much time in this museum, what I find myself looking for more and more are these categories, this complexity, and missing their absence. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Isabel. Very informative, of course. Thank you so much. Lots of great ideas. I don't see Stella here. Is she in the room?
She somehow couldn't make it because there was a last minute emergency. I did receive her email.
Sounds good. So I'm going to turn it to Cessare and Kim to comments and ask any questions if you like. You have maybe 7 minutes for both of you.
5 minutes each, yeah.
Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Isabel. That was an incredible presentation, and it's so great to hear how your fieldwork is going and to actually, find out more about your research project. It's just fascinating. Thank you so much. I really wasn't aware of the Bolivian context, but so many of the things you presented today are resonating with sort of other case studies that I'm more familiar with, and yeah, other literature that I've read, and I'll get onto that. But just to summarize and sort of make sure that we're on the same page, I think your sort of overview of Bolivian history was really helpful to set the context, talking about national identity, ethnic identity, and indigenous identity, and how all of those like play out in the museum. And it's interesting to bring in then your expertise in museums to see how I love how you talked about museum actors, like how those actors within the museum and the institution itself sort of interact with, you know, political, essentially, political events or political identity in the country. Thank you for giving that breakdown as well about decolonization and the language of decolonization, and sort of bringing that nuance that I think it's very, you know, context specific. I don't think you would see that sort of like nuance in language in maybe other countries or other case studies. So that was really helpful. And it was also really interesting to hear about sort of museum practices and the particular case study. I guess my first question would be about the case study selection. You gave the really nice table, and I was wondering if you wanted to say a little bit more about why you chose those 4 case studies. I saw that you had sort of like research interest column, so maybe you want to talk a little bit more about that. And then my second part of the sort of comment and question would be about specifically the case studies, the case study that you focused on, the Museum of Ethnography and Folklore. Obviously, I didn't know about that case study, but again, so many things seem to resonate with other decolonization projects that I've read about. You talked, I'm really interested in objects and how museums present and talk about objects. So it was really interesting to hear about water and how that particular museum sort of talked about water, or sort of they was a sort of how they thought they were talking about water, and then what it was actually on display. So water represented rather than sort of like an actor in itself, seen as a resource, a tool, which is very sort of like Western concept, Western way of understanding the world, is, if I'm understanding that correctly, almost like a capitalist way of presenting that particular concept. And the same went for like indigeneity and how like it sort of reproduced the same view of the world that often happens in Western museums, of thinking of indigenous people as like an idyllic past, still in the sort of a stillness and timelessness about it, a very nature instead of culture, and that sort of dichotomy. I'm thinking about dichotomies. So essentially what I think you were saying there is that particular museum, there are instances of reproducing the same view of the world, the same understandings in sort of decolonial projects. And the 2 works that really I think are speak to me in that sense are an essay called "The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized" by Sumaya Kasim, which you might be familiar with, specifically talking about how decolonial projects in the UK as well often fail because of the sort of nature of museums, and how you would need to scrap the whole idea of museums to make decolonization work. And then the other one that I was thinking of is the work of Njabulo Chipangura, specifically museums as agents of change. And Njabulo talks about the National Museum of Zimbabwe, and like you, sort of picks out how, because museums are sort of a Western institution, then to decolonize them is hard. It's these views are like very pervasive, and these systems of knowledge sort of get reproduced not for malicious intent. It's just because they're so pervasive, they end up sort of tainting the decolonial projects as well. And I think the ultimate question that you're bringing to us is, do museums serve us in this case? Is the museum project useful, or should it be like fully scrapped? And I think that was such an inspiring and interesting way of sort of presenting the case study and then showing us that final question. So yeah, if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that and about sort of the implications of questioning the nature of museums, that would be great. But just to summarize, so my first question was about the selection of case studies and whether you want to talk a little bit more about that. And the second about the sort of, yeah, do we need museums? Thank you so much.
Over to you, Geonyoung.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was really fascinating. And I think the presentation itself, the structure is very clear, because I wasn't very familiar with Bolivian's context, and also I'm not an expertise in coloniality and decolonization. So the history introduction part was really helpful. And I have so much to resonate with the challenges part, because I also work in museum. It's kind of similar situation, except that my topic is in reconciliation and post-conflict society. So a lot of challenges that I can resonate with you. Thank you very much for sharing the difficulties and challenges. I hope there will be some opportunity in the future to share with you. I have two questions, but I don't know. Maybe if you don't want to answer this question, it's just pure of my interest, so you don't have to answer. The first question is, I found it really interesting, and that you had a concept. It's called non-museo practitioner. Is that correct? Is there was something like that? I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this concept, because I assume it's opposed to museum practitioner. I wonder, is there always a clear cut between museum practitioner and non-museum practitioner? And maybe also build on this, could you share to what extent do you think this concept is helpful for you to unpack the relationship or the museum representation of indigeneity? Is this clear, the question? And the second question is, the whole presentation is about decolonization and a little bit about different concepts on decolonization, like the decolonial and discolonialization. That was really interesting. I wonder, because you're looking for 4 case museums, I wonder, in these 4 museums, the subject they want to decolonize, is it always clear? Is there a difference between these 4 museums? Yeah, because I feel like maybe these 4 museums, they have different mission. Maybe their original mission wasn't intent to decolonization. It's the researcher's role to pick up the decolonial part of these museums. So I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts, if you wish. That's all from my side. Thank you very much for your talk. I learned so much, and congratulations for your success in fieldwork.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Isabel, yes, go ahead.
Okay, then, thank you for your questions. So I'll just go in order, I think. So about the case study selection, I wanted to study national museums, public institutions, because of the uniqueness of Bolivia, that it has a plurinational state, that decolonization is one of its new foundation principles. And so I think it was important to see how, or whether in a context where everything is guided towards having a decolonial practice, there are still a lot of challenges, and it's still very, very complicated, like Cessare also mentioned. So I thought that was important, and I also the reason I chose, for example, this museum I've talked about more, the ethnography and folklore, is because it's a very well-known institution. So they have engaged in a more critical change of their exhibitions, of how they narrate. So this has begun in 2014 with a director who is still now in place. And so the idea of having of changing a bit the perspectives, of focusing more on material culture, comes from that moment. So that's what interested me there. I think that, well, I think it's interesting also to combine with some of the latter questions, because not all museums, when I've been there, they don't have this decolonizing thing at the center, but it is still lateral. So in national museums, one of their strategies, one of their aims, their objectives, like in a project management kind of sense, has to be to decolonize. Now that means everything and nothing, right? So for some of them, it can be more like a democratizing thing, like taking some exhibitions outside of the main city, but it is something that is, because they're part of the state, that has to be within their programs and planning. Then thinking about the other museums, the ones that are not national museums that I chose, so this community museum and the Arte Campo Museum, I think it was these non-museal purposes. I think it's in the research questions. I wouldn't say it's a concept, it's just a word that I kind of invented that suited me. But because I thought it was interesting, especially in Arte Campo, because it's a project that began in the 80s in the lowlands and had to do more with helping, supporting Indigenous women to get a livelihood. So it was craft making and doing this connection from the countryside and the city. The people that have coordinated it come from the city. They are part of like the Santa Cruz elites. But yeah, that was the main reason. But it coincided with this maybe intangible heritage protection and capacity building, and it has been until 2017 that they created the museum. So that's why I would like to know and see why they at what point, how do they decide to make this museum? So I think there's a lot of clues around it, and it's interesting because before they had the museum, they had a store in the city, which is a bit like an exhibition space, a little bit with the labels and stuff. And so there are a lot of things that come from an economic purpose, but that have the similar result. But in that case, well, I haven't really gone in depth, but I can't really say that they have a decolonization as a main thing, because we have to also think that the lowlands, Santa Cruz, have had different processes of colonizing and of oppression of the indigenous people there. Like I was saying, right now the state is closer to the Andean indigenous people, but not necessarily to the people represented in that museum. So I think I'm getting a bit, it's all a bit messy, but that's just actually how it is. It is very messy. And the other question, I think, about the projects, about the objects and the water. I think there are very good intentions in this museum, in the Museum of Ethnography and Folklore, but I do think that they are limited by the museum seriousness. I think that is accompanied also by being a national museum and having this job as curators, because it's very unique. There are maybe 5 posts of curator in Bolivia. So there's also this question and how they maybe I'm going out of what you asked, but like how they perform their role and as being experts and scholars and stuff. It's not so much that they will go and perform their indigeneity in the museum. So that was interesting when I would talk to them. And so maybe I think that's why they are. It also reduces their capacity to be a bit more transgressive with what they are doing in the more museum part, the more exhibitions and labels and maybe activities. In the other, I think they have more influence on critical research, critical scholarship, and that allows them to open a bit more to elaborate a bit more this discourse, this writing, this oral expression, written expression. I think that those are the differences there. But yeah, that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for your answers. Thank you, Cesare and Kim, for your questions and comments. Very, very interesting discussion, and a lot of coming to mind. And I can share some, of course, but I would like to give the opportunity for the audience to ask questions and make comments as well. So, do we have any questions from the audiences? Anybody, please feel free to unmute yourself and share any comments or questions you have. I hear nothing. Okay. Oh, here we go. Kim again. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the answer. I have another question. I wonder if you had a chance to see who are the main audience, who are the main visitors of the groups at the folklore museum, yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I didn't really focus much on that. To be honest, it's quite empty, the museum. There's not a lot of visitors. I think it's designed and it's more attractive to tourists, to international tourists. But I also think that in some ways, these exhibitions are addressed to people when they're addressed. They might resonate a lot with people from Bolivia who may feel a loss of their ancestrality. And so that's why maybe seeing those very pure and all these ceremonies and these wonderful celebrations and knowledge might be a way to connect with that, because it's also something that they have lost, that has been lost in the past centuries of erasure, but also these new ways of living and adapting to this very urban world. Yeah.
Dr. Vishnu?
Yeah,
you
just
have
a
a
quick
question?
one. Thank you. And also, thank you for presenting your wonderful research. I know you are still at an infancy stage in your project. I think it's fair to say that there's a fair amount of discussions in the whole decolonization agenda in academia, not least, we are also being advised to, make effort wherever and whenever possible to decolonize curriculums and use case studies and those kind of things within our academic and within our teaching practices. You briefly mentioned about positionality in your research and how your own position in respect to the participants that you are going to be working with are likely to influence, your own research work. I'm just wondering, do you share, to start with? Have you got any commonality? Do you share any kind of affiliations or common identity with the people that you will be closely working with? And if that is the case, then what are the strategies you might want to, or what are the strategies that you have considered for you to be able to maintain that position as an independent, neutral researcher? Thank you.
I think that's a very good questions that I have to often ask, so it's hard to have an answer really. So as my position, I think that it depends on the case studies, but mostly what really I felt with this museum was it wasn't that much distance, in the sense that we all speak Spanish, we all live in the cities, they all have Western, it's not even Western, it's education that exists in Bolivia for already hundreds of years. So we are all indigenous people, everybody, we are all pierced by coloniality. And of course, I am very much aware of that we're pierced in different ways. When I went to the community museum, so this is in Huancoyo, it is an hour drive from La Paz. It is really rural. That's where I felt a bigger distance. People, when they weren't talking to me, they were speaking in Aymara. They have a different life because they have to wake up to get for the cows, because they live from selling cow milk. So I couldn't just say, well, I'll just hang around today. They had to say, okay, tell me at what time you're coming, because I need to organize my life, and it's not on the weekend, it's nothing. So I did feel that a bit more, and it also and I also decided it was a bit more complicated, but I also took a little step back because I felt I wasn't prepared I wasn't prepared enough, because I'm not an anthropologist. But I felt that I could, even if people in the Museum of Ethnography and Folklore, they also identify as Aymara, and they also have much stronger connections with indigenous cultures. We do have the familiarity of the museum and talking about museum stuff, and I felt like that made it easier, that I wasn't coming with this like very outdated, like coming from outside and trying to understand something, but I felt like it was a different way of relating to them. But yeah, I don't know about neutrality and objectiveness, because it's very hard to also because I have experience working in cultural institutions, so sometimes I'm just angry because I feel like something is but it's very subjective. But I hopefully it will come along, and I have good supervisors that will put the brakes on when I'm being a bit too subjective, arbitrary.
I just wanted to allude this one, because this is a potential area when the examination comes, that this could be a questions that might be asked by the examiner. This was certainly an area where I got into a little bit of hot water when I did my own PhD. So yeah, so
that's very good to know. Thank you.
Make sure you have
thanks for sharing.
Make sure you have a good couple of pages reflecting on these.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot.
That was a very good question, and the answer is also great, because it seems like you're being mindful to who you are and the community you're dealing with. So this mindfulness is good way, or is a good starting way for reflection and recognizing, how you can be more objective in your assessment as much as you can. Of course, we all humans, and we do our best, because you cannot just remove all your experiences, your identity, when you do your research as part of who you are. Yeah, you cannot change it, but by being mindful and aware of this can make you more reflective researcher. So yeah, great point. I saw another hand raising is Maskira. Lena, do you want to ask a question, or you change your mind?
No, I was just interacting with Isabel responses. Just thumbs up, yeah.
Okay, okay, excellent. Any other comments? We have a couple more minutes for a final comment or question. If you have
I think-
any.
I have one small comment.
Yes.
But before that, I would like to say thank you very much. I mean, it's a wonderful presentation. Even though it is focusing on the museum, but from the museum studies perspective, you added a lot to understanding of decolonization, because decolonization thing is going on in different fields. So from that perspective, it's something, it's providing a fresh perspective. But with regard to positionality, I think it's I am not sure if you heard of a term usually used by anthropologists, and that term is getting native. So the way it happens is there's a critique about Western anthropologists. Then when they participate, they do their ethnography, and the argument is that actually it is their perception of other people's cultures, and whatever they produce is their knowledge production about other people. But then the counter argument is that when you participate, direct participation in someone's culture, over a time, you start feeling, in the same way in which those people feel about their culture. So I'm not saying, I mean, it is slightly different from the museum studies, but positionality can be addressed. The problem of positionality can be addressed if you somehow borrow that technique into the research methods which you are using, and somehow able to establish that actually you were so much entangled with the people, the subjects you were studying, that somehow the getting native experience you came across during your research. So that to some extent could address the problem of positionality, not completely, but somehow you can address that. But at the same time, I must say that it's not a problem at all, that if there is, we all have positions. Highlighting and accepting that is enough. I think that is accepting your own subjectivity is the best objectivity.
I like that. I like that. Okay, Dr. Hollis, you have a comment?
Yes, I wanted to thank you so much for inviting me to this. This has been fascinating. You did a wonderful job with your presentation. I have graduate degrees in anthropology and African studies and African American studies. And I kept thinking all the way through, why were the museums in Nigeria so different? I spent 2 years teaching in Nigeria right after independence, which was like 60 years ago. And I visited almost all the major museums, and none of the things you talked about, like the dioramas and statues of indigenous people and things, none of that. What I saw were all the beautiful artifacts from Ife and Benin and all these different places. And also, and even so early on after independence, galleries with modern contemporary Nigerian artists. And I thought, well, what is the difference? And the only thing that occurred to me was that the colonizers did not go to Nigeria to take over the land and live there. They used to talk about West Africa being white man's grave. And so you didn't have a population of colonizers that were living there. Have you had any experience with Africa, or any thoughts about, because that was the only thing I could think about, why the museum, and nowadays there's a huge life of contemporary African artists and really lively museums that are starting to also celebrate dance and festivals and things, because all that still exists. You know, even among people who have doctorates and are professional people, they still participate, particularly in the cities like in Abeokuta and Benin City. So I was just trying to figure out, so that would be a conference of another sort to really do the contrast between countries where the colonizers came and lived and sort of took it over, or countries where they came and had an influence but did not stay and move their families there or anything.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting. I can't say that I know much about Africa, so I don't want to say anything too stupid. But I do think that the periods of colonization are very different. So,
Yeah.
well, South America, it was for like 4 centuries. And also when we talk about these museums, because sometimes when you talk maybe more Asian museums, they were created by the colonial administrators. But when I talk about these ones, they're old museums. They're from the 60s, the 50s. So in this nationalist movement is when they were created. So it's a bit harder. It's not hard. It's just different to understand them. So they're not like colonial museums that are now changing to become more indigenous. They were always Bolivian nationalist, but it's just we've gone through so many paradigm changes in what it is to be Bolivian. But yeah, I think it's really important. And that's also why I took the time to try to give a clear idea of the context of Bolivia, that it is so different. And even talking about like these dichotomies of Western or indigenous, a lot of things, a lot of indigenous people have very Western, like the way they dress. They come from Vienna because in the 19th century something happened. So it is an exercise of nuance to talk about this this culture and its museums. But thank you. Thanks for your comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hollis.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. We're kind of went over our time, but before we leave, I just want to, share a quick comment about when you mentioned something about decolonization and the different strategies museum use, and one of them is hiring indigenous people. I think that's great. In the U.S., this is a great, a huge discussion about the diversification of museum staff. But I would highly encourage you to think about 2D diversity. And this is something that I discussed in one of my papers, which means considering not just the racial background of the candidates, it's also their lived experiences, their background, where they come from, because sometimes you can hire somebody who looks different, but they think the same way as the colonizer. So you didn't do anything. If you just want to do something just to be superficial and look good, yes, you can hire an Asian, an African American, a white guy with, an Hispanic guy, and take a picture of the museum staff, put it in your museum website. We're diversified, but we're thinking the same way. We're doing the same exact thing that we've been doing for the past 200 years, no difference. But when you think about 2D diversity, we need people who think in different ways. We live the different experiences. They can come with different ideas and ways of contributing to the museum narrative and collecting and other aspects. So I just wanted to leave, this thought with you. You're doing great work. Thank you so much. Thank you, Newman, for organizing this, and everybody who attended. Appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you on another discussion. Thank you.
Look after yourself. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Bye-bye. Bye.